AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today I am delighted to welcome back a remarkable guest. Alex Rose is a full-time author. He was born in the U.S., grew up in Australia, educated in Britain, lived for a while and worked in Canada, and now lives in New York. He has a doctorate in history from Cambridge University, worked for a short time as a journalist, and now is a full-time researcher and author, and a very, very good one. His first book, which you most likely know, is Washington Spies, the critically acclaimed story of one of the very, very early spy networks during the Revolutionary War, inspired and in some cases handled by George Washington. Until more recently, his most recent book was The Lion and the Fox, an equally interesting story about the Confederate Navy during the Civil War, their efforts to run the Northern blockade and get the aid of businessmen and shipbuilders in Liverpool, England, to help build them a fleet of blockade runners. But very recently, Alex has another exciting new book out. It's called Phantom Fleet, and it's the story of Allied efforts to combat the German U-boat fleet, which was the scourge of the Atlantic during World War II. Alex, welcome back to AFIO Now.
Well, thanks for having me back on, James. Nice to be here.
Alex, tell our audience just a little bit about some of the resources that you were able to access to research this book.
Well, there's a huge number of them, basically like any World War II subject, which is one of the reasons why I wasn't ever really that keen on doing a World War II book, because I was always so overwhelmed by the amount of material available. I mean, hundreds of miles worth of paper was a daunting prospect. But for this particular book, I focused on the U-boat war and one particular incident during the U-boat war involving the U.S. Navy and Allied American intelligence. So that really narrowed down the amount of paper I had to read. But my main sources, I think, were, casting my mind back, were essentially a lot of the original German U-boat logs, registers, which fill in a huge amount of information. There are several, obviously, there's numerous books about it. But in terms of primary documentation, especially from the U.S. Navy angle, there's a lot in the National Archives. There's a lot at the Naval Academy at Annapolis, U.S. Naval Institute. I also could call on the expertise of several sort of experts on this who sent me sort of once classified files on the subject and so on. So there was a lot of material there. You just have to plow through and to cut through and get to the story. So those are my main sources. And also there were also some biographies, a couple of memoirs, a lot of letters. I went to the museum in Chicago, I think it's called the Griffin Museum of Science and Industry now, where they actually keep the captured submarine by the U.S. Navy, and they, in all places in Chicago. And they have a special wing for it, but they have very large archives, which I don't think very few people have ever been into. But there they have, when I went there, they had thousands and thousands of pages of records about this, including stuff that's I don't think it's even in the National Archives. So they had things like the medical records of the captured U-boat crew, because they were examined by Navy doctors when they were taken prisoner and so on. So you have all and with their photographs and there's letters and there's diaries and newspaper articles from the 50s. There's a lot of stuff there, but it all worked out. That's my job, basically, is to filter all that for your reading pleasure.
Describe for our audience the impact that German U-boats were having all the way up to the coast of the United States in the early parts of World War II.
Yeah, that's a really interesting subject about which I knew, hardly anything. I'd heard when I started, I didn't really know anything about U-boats or the U-boat war any more than any regular sort of man on the street would. But when I was looking into it, I began the story with essentially the German attack on America in early January 1942. So a couple of weeks after Hitler's declaration of war in the United States, after Pearl Harbor. And it was an extraordinary episode. It was called Paukenschlag, the operation, which means roll of drums. I call it drum beat, catchier. But essentially, they sent a handful of U-boats across the Atlantic, and they prowled up and down the East Coast, all the way from New York. They started in New York, and eventually they would work their way all the way down past the Carolinas, Cape Hatteras, and so on, and all the way down to Florida and the Caribbean. And you'd think just a handful of submarines wouldn't be that big of a deal, but they caused colossal amounts of damage to American shipping. I mean, over several months, they sank hundreds of oil tankers right at the bottom of the sea. And they were doing this off sometimes just a few miles off the US coast. If you were sitting on a beach, you could actually see ships sinking and oil slicks floating in and things like that. Hundreds of American servicemen were killed and drowned in these attacks. And the Americans, the most interesting was how unprepared the Americans were for this otherwise small onslaught of literally a handful. There was I don't think at any time there was any more than 13. There was usually about 6 submarines going up and down the coast. So the Americans were completely swatted by it. And it took them several months. And this is what I found interesting. It took them several months to get geared up, to start learning about the ways and mentalities and the actions of U-boats, how they move, how they think, with the best ways to combat them, all that operational stuff, which is really very hard to do. So that's how the book opens. And there's some striking scenes when you have a U-boat literally off New York, sinking ships that are lit up, that are like a cavalcade of lights, and they can see the Wonder Wheel at the huge Ferris wheel in New York, and Coney Island, and you have baseball teams playing at night with their stadiums lit up like fun fairs, which provide a very helpful beacon to U-boats to get their bearings 50 miles out to sea. So it was this incredible period, and at the same time, the Americans had, virtually no anti-submarine forces. I calculated it, and I think at the beginning of the operation, if you include the boats, the great anti-submarine fleet of the U.S. Navy, combined with the Coast Guard, they had something like 3, maybe 4 operational boats at that time, which for a coast that's a couple of thousand miles long is insufficient, I think, is to understate it. So, and they have very few depth charges. They don't know how to hunt these things. They're completely, all the best pilots from the USSAF had been seconded to, in an emergency, to Pearl Harbor, obviously, to the Pacific, where the main threat was. So they had a bunch of green crews for what would become Army Air Force bombers. They had a handful of old ones who had never been trained in sea operations. They were used to dropping high explosive bombs on cities. That's what they were trained for, not objects that were 600 feet long moving underwater, where you have to try and get a depth charge near them. So, and or a torpedo in them. So it was a complete chaos in the U.S. Navy. A complete panic stations for several months. So that, again, I found it. I had no idea that it was basically that bad when I started, because we're so used to thinking of the U-boat war almost in terms of the Royal Navy, because the British, bless them, have had a kind of a monopoly on U-boat war writing, really, for many decades. So we tend to get that story, and they'd been fighting U-boats for 2 years before that. So the U.S. Navy were coming to this pretty in a primitive way, and that's what I found interesting. And after a couple of years, they got really good at it, which is sort of a rousing end to the story.
Alex, who was Admiral Ernest King, and what was his role?
Ernest King was just, again, he's this fascinating character who became almost omnipotent with the U.S. Navy. He was due to retire just a couple of weeks before he was appointed, essentially commander of all U.S. Navy, like chief of naval operations, the ultimate command of all theaters of the Navy. He'd been due to retire, and it was an event that everybody save Ernest King had been really looking forward to. He was as they say, a difficult man to get along with. He would chew out subordinates. He would before the war anyway, he was essentially a drunk. I mean, he would get very handsy with other officers' wives, stuff that's a little not entirely approved nowadays, that kind of behavior. He would yell at people. He brooked no dissent. But the thing with King is that if you survived the gauntlet under him, he had a loyalist forever, because he would give his junior officers, lieutenants, captains, and so on, more leeway to operate independently or autonomously than anybody else. His maxim was, don't nurse them. Just give them the orders, tell them what you want to do, let them get about it. So he was a difficult man. So he's due to retire, and the Navy was in chaos, as I said, during the Operation Roll of Drums, and so he was called back into service. I think Ernest King himself said, when the going gets tough, they call the bastards in, and he was sort of the ultimate bastard. He was like a pattern of the Navy. The thing with King was he has this terrible reputation, especially among the British, for being obstreperous, difficult, uncooperative, all that kind of thing. The weird thing is that he was his army counterparts, like Marshall and the other generals, all thought exactly the same thing about the king. I mean, they all couldn't stand him. And the reason is that he was just incredibly, he wasn't particularly anti-British. He wasn't particularly anti-army. He was just incredibly pro-Navy. So anyone who attempted to use a euphemism like joint command, he read as, you're trying to take over my ships. And so that's when the walls would come up and he would come at you like a battering ram. So that's where he got this reputation from. But for British officers, and there's quite a few of them, like Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, they got on perfectly fine with him because they didn't try and intrude on his turf. As long as the US Navy remained an independent, then he would be he'd be sort of curt, but he'd be perfectly amicable with you. So that he's an interesting character, but he's the only man essentially who was, again, he was the right man at the right moment, and he got reappointed to head the Navy. So that's King's story, and that he's the guy who starts pushing that we are going to attack U-boats. We're not going to huddle around forever in convoys. That's what weaklings do. We're going to do some convoy work for a while we're gathering pace and gathering steam and raising our industrial resources. But after a while, we are going to churn out 1,000 destroyers, and we are going to sink these guys wherever their lairs are. So that would made him very different from a lot of other admirals who he has this aggressiveness of a pattern rather than the sort of diplomacy of an Eisenhower in many ways. So that was Ernest King in a nutshell.
That's about Commander Roger Wynne and Room 41.
Roger Wynne is, again, a forgotten figure. He's a British figure, British sort of naval reserve. He wasn't a professional naval officer or anything like that. But he was in charge of, and he had polio when he was a child. So he had like a twisted spine, and he limped with a cane and so on. Before the war, he'd been a very eminent barrister in London. He was quite brilliant. He was in charge, because the British like to hire a bunch of eccentrics to, as we all know, to man their intelligence units, like in special operations executive and so on. But he's part of that wave where he would come in, and he essentially ran a British anti-submarine operation or tracking operations, the tracking room of the Admiralty. So he was the one who began thinking seriously about how to find submarines at sea and defend against them. And what his job was to arrange for convoys to divert around U-boat packs or independent U-boats. So he began understanding. He was the first man really to understand U-boats, and that they act and behave in certain ways. But that makes them predictable. When they're predictable, you can do the unpredictable thing and get around them. So he was in charge of that. And so he comes over sometime in 1941 to Washington, part of the great Anglo-American alliance type thing. And he manages to get a meeting with King. This is after a month of hanging around in Washington, sort of seeing officers of successively higher ranks and trying to persuade them of this crazy idea that I can track submarines. I know how to do it. And no one believed him because it was considered at that time to be an impossible mission. These were mysterious beasts that moved in no predictable way. They would just at sea, they would attack at random times. You couldn't stop them. That's why you had to huddle together in convoys, you see, because that provided, they were like, with a few destroyers as kind of sheepdogs to protect the flock, and that would keep the wolves at bay as best as possible, to preserve the supply line, the key supply lines to Britain and the rest of, to North Africa and North Russia and so on. But so Wynne has this crazy idea, which he keeps pitching to various vice admirals and rear admirals and admirals and so on, until finally he gets to see King, and he tells him what he can do. And King believes him and says, great, I want an American room. Let's do it. And so King appoints sort of this mild-mannered, bespectacled reserve officer who had bad eyesight. So he'd been cashiered out of the Navy and was running like the Navy's, I think he was running the Navy's ROTC program in Texas or something like that, and calls him back and says, right, you're now in charge of an American anti-submarine room, but I want no British officers in there at all. But you're going to run it a few doors down from my office at Maine Navy and the Navy Department building, and you're going to report to me pretty much every day. And that man is Commander Kenneth Knowles, again a completely obscure, forgotten figure. Later went on to join the CIA some years after the war. I think he became a deputy or assistant director, something like that. A very smart guy, not as smart as Wynne. But so Knowles flies over to London to get his training, to sit at the feet of the master. So he spends several months in the operations of the tracking room in London, just watching Wynne operate and how he does it, and he learns. So he goes back in sort of mid-1942 and sets up his room, the tracking room at U.S. Navy, and that's how it all begins. And from that point, U.S. Navy tracking of submarines exponentially improves.
Describe some of the early submarine countermeasures that Admiral King and Knowles developed after they created their own tracking room.
Well, the key one, apart from the weaponry, the Allies were working on the technology of this, depth charges, torpedoes. They were working out the best angle of attack for airplanes, the best way of using destroyers to search patterns for, they were trying to work it out mathematically, using a bunch of sort of scientists. Well, I had to leave them out of the book, but there was a whole chapter about them. But they're an interesting bunch of guys. But Knowles didn't do any of that stuff. What Knowles did which was known as it was basically the most secret room in America. It was called F21, which was the submarine tracking room. And within that, there was an even more secret room called F211 to frustrate any clever spies. It was essentially the size of a broom cupboard at the back of the room, which he had the key to. And that was the Enigma decryption room, where he would receive decrypts of Enigma messages that Wynne was using as well. So the British were sending their stuff over about picking up the radio transmissions from the submarines. And that was one of the key weapons at their disposal in that. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but Wynne and Knowles weren't code breakers. They read this stuff in English. It was brokered by Bletchley Park and also later on by U.S. Navy's intelligence people, the OP-21, OP-20G. And that stuff, they would be picking up transmissions, wireless transmissions from the U-boats back to Admiral Dönitz in Europe, the head of the U-boat fleet, and later of the whole Reichsmarine. And they would detect clues about where submarines, who they were, where they were going, what the missions were, when they were likely to return, their levels of torpedoes, their operations procedures, all this sort of stuff. So that was a key point, were the Enigma decrypts. But again, raises the question, if the Allies, people always forget, if the Allies could read Enigma, why didn't the war end in 1942? Right? It's like if they could read everything and they knew everything. They obviously didn't know everything. There were blackouts, there were brownouts. Dönitz would change the codes every so often. It was an incredibly difficult thing to decrypt. There were time delays of several weeks sometimes. So Wynne, and this is what he taught Knowles, but Wynne was the real specialist in this, was to use other clues. Basically what we would call open source intelligence. So yes, they would get copies, they would listen to German radio. They would listen to regular radio and they would if they got any prisoners, they would take very careful interrogation notes on them. They would pay attention to German Navy newspapers and things like that, because those papers published photos, and the radio transmissions would have accolades for successful U-boat captains coming home. And from that, you could discern lots of interesting information about the captains themselves, and you could build it. And up from that, you could build up a profile of these captains. The British got so good at this stuff that they would keep files on each U-boat captain and the crew, whether they were green, whether they were good, if there were like troubles aboard, if someone didn't like the warrant officer, something like that, just scuttlebutt, gossip, stuff like that. It was so good that after the war, when there was one U-boat commander who saw his own file, they had things like what sports team he supported, what his favorite type of liquor was, his home address, things like. They had just had a huge amount of material on the end. So what the essential point of all this is to create profiles, and to create profiles of each captain, as I said, and also of the U-boats themselves, because the Germans didn't make it easy to identify boats. So they didn't paint their numbers on the side with the name of the captain and things like that. They would keep that stuff secret. But what WIN is doing, and also Knowles, is they're linking data points, and they would use literally index cards, 5x8s, keeping tabs, various forms of data on these guys, sort of a premature data, basically a database, a primitive database of these things. And they had hundreds and hundreds of cards after a while. And from that, again, they would treat these U-boats not as this faceless blob menace that that would just come out of nowhere. These are machines that are powered and operated by humans, and humans have weaknesses, and so do the submarines, and they work in a certain way. They will likely do something in a certain way. And as I said, it leads to predictability, which is always a great vulnerability when you have that stuff on the enemy. So essentially, that they had a whole sort of a spectrum of weapons. It wasn't just Enigma and that's it. It was a lot more than that, and it took years to put this stuff together.
Did tensions develop between the British and the Americans over tactics in attacking the German U-boats?
It wasn't really a fight. I mean, when you're dealing with Ernest King, there's always a fight of some kind, but it was that there were two different approaches, and they were both sensible. There's nobody wrong in either of these. The British, being on an island, 23 miles away from coastal France, that had recently survived the Battle of Britain and so on, was unbelievably completely reliant, 99% reliant on imports of just stuff like brass, rubber, food to an extent. It was nearly self-sufficient, but they needed food, oil especially, things like that. And not just for Britain, but to be sent on to the Russians and sent to, say, North Africa or later Italy and so on. Britain is the great staging point. Britain had recently, as I said, survived an onslaught, Operation Sea Lion during the Battle of Britain. So they were pretty cagey about their own survival. So they relied on supply lines, and those supply lines came from the US and also from their own empire, but heavily from the US. And so the key thing for them was to protect those supply lines. The best way of protecting your supply lines is to make cargo ships, freighters, tankers, travel in large convoys. And they worked it out mathematically that the larger the convoy, there was a certain number of destroyers where you would actually get to a certain state of high efficiency. And so they were very defensive minded. When they built destroyers, those destroyers and aircraft to overhead would stay with the convoy and protect it all the way over to Britain. And likewise, on the way back, though, the ships were, of course, empty by then. The Americans and the King started like that because they had to. They had very few spare destroyers. The ones they had were from World War I, and most of them hadn't even been built for Atlantic weather. Anyway, these things used to flood all the time. We'll go up and down like this, and they were like winter Atlantic waves. So, but King always made it clear from the very beginning that this was just going to be stage one, that for the time being, until we build up our resources roughly in 1943. 1943 is always the key year in World War II for America's matchless productive capacity. Once he had the aircraft, once he had the torpedoes, once he had the sonar detectors, once he had the destroyers, once he had the training and all this kind of stuff, that these destroyers would sally out from the convoys. They would go further out and they would try and get the U-boats before they came anywhere near the convoy. They wouldn't just wait for the U-boats to sort of attack or prowl off just a few miles behind. And then later, owing to Knowles' ability to track submarines that he later created, this is in very late 1943, early 1944, and this was under Knowles' urging, that he would create special task forces known as hunter-killer groups or hunter-killer forces that would consist of ready-made small aircraft carriers, very little armor. These weren't the great Pacific aircraft carriers we all think of. These were essentially a freighter with a steel decks bolted on top. And they had a very small complement of older airplanes. The newer ones went to the Pacific. And they'd have 3 or 4 destroyers and a supply ship and all that kind of stuff. And they weren't assigned to convoys. Their job was to hunt and kill submarines wherever they were. So they would be fully autonomous. And that's where the real story of U-505 and the capture of U-505 starts. The king wants to go out there and just be aggressive. So that's how there was an evolution of American strategy. The British were never really on board with this. They just wanted to stick with convoys because they worked. Why mess with perfection kind of thing? So yeah, there was a distinct difference or debate in Navy, Admiralty, U.S. Navy circles about this strategy. And the British were pretty hostile to it because it used Enigma to what they thought carelessly to find submarines, and that the Americans are playing a little fast and loose with their security with this stuff. But that was a whole different argument about the importance of Enigma. But that was a very long explanation for a very short question.
So who was U.S. Navy Captain Dan Gallagher, and what was his role?
Dan Gallagher is one of the great characters of the U.S. Navy. He was quite well known in the 1930s. The U.S. Navy was a very small place, very small world. So he knew King. I think he'd been to flight school with him, back when going to flight school was a seriously dangerous occupation back in the 1920s. There was crashes all the time. And I think it's something like a third of their flight class died during training or very soon afterward. It was a dangerous line of work. But Gallagher was very keen on this. And Gallagher was the son of a Chicago lawyer. I call him Mirthless. He was a Catholic Irish lawyer, very serious, always referred to his sons, and he had 4 sons, all of whom went into the Navy because the dad insisted on this. 3 of them became admirals. One of them was a chaplain. And so an illustrious family. And Gallagher himself was completely the opposite from his dad, who was this sort of mirthless figure of pure discipline and admonishment at all times. He used to write to his instructors at the Naval Academy to punish Gallagher harder if he got a B. He was that kind of dad. But Gallagher was completely the opposite of him. I mean, he was this small, wiry fellow with jug ears, sort of a goofy smile. He had this really corny 1930s sense of humor. It comes from watching too many Looney Tunes and listening to too many comedy radio shows and so on, and essentially what we would call really bad dad jokes nowadays. He had a weakness for them, but very friendly, quite eccentric. He was a sort of a very lightweight wrestler. He actually went to the Olympics, but got beaten pretty quickly. But he was always doing things unconventionally. If there was a front door, Dan Gallagher would always find the side window that he could slither through. Basically, that was his technique. That was his sort of method. So he's in 1941. He's in duty. He's in charge of a naval air base in Iceland, and it was an important job. His job was to send up Catalinas, the sort of bombers, and they would again fly out for 5 hours from near Reykjavik, near the airbase, and fly out and meet an Allied convoy going this way or that, and escort them for a couple of 100 miles, and then fly back 5 hours to Reykjavik. It was this rather tedious existence. But the key thing about him is that they weren't sinking any submarines, and he was getting aggravated about it. And so he horrors, he closed the officers' bar until somebody sunk a submarine. And of course, that's in the proper animating spirit, which to get the boys motivated to do something. And so there's one time where one of the pilots sinks a submarine, or it's captured later, and they open the officers' bar, and everyone gets roaringly drunk, and they start talking about it'd be really cool if you could capture a submarine, and if you could do that, how would you do it? And so there's a lot of, as Gallery recalls, there's a lot of big talk in what is it in Veritas, sort of in Wine There Is Truth thing. And they come up with this cockamamie plan that you would use a Catalina bomber, which has, I think, 8 men aboard, and it would drop depth charges, get the submarine above water, and then it would land next to it, because it was a seaplane, floaters, and it would land next to it, and then there would be this commando group who would travel over to the submarine, and they would throw a chain down the open hatch in the conning tower to stop the Germans closing the hatch, and then they would throw some grenades down, and then they would take over the submarine and just take it, and then they would capture the submarine, and they would bring it back home, and they would be the John Paul Jones of World War II. It was all about the glory and the adventure of it. There was no real tactical or strategic need for this, but it was something that they wanted to do because they were sort of young, red-blooded males of a certain age, and they thought it would be a hell of a lot of fun. Now, of course, as they said, this is a cockamamie plan. It's nuts in that the German submarines can take care of themselves. They have deck guns, which are very dangerous. They have a crew of 50, whereas the Catalina has maybe 8, and they're also quite well armed, and they can hold off 3 or 4 destroyers at a time if they need to. They're pretty fierce creatures, especially when they're cornered. And landing a Catalina on the waves next to a submarine, and then somehow getting over to something. None of this was thought out because that's boring, right? But anyway, so Dan then puts it aside. He gets back to his job for the next several months. But it's one of these things where there's a seed in the back of his head that this is something that I really want to do. And so it takes him a few years, and it's not until early 1944, and he's appointed captain of the Guadalcanal, which was one of those aircraft carriers I mentioned before, in charge of one of the new hunter-killer groups. And so Gallery just wants the first thing on his agenda is to go capture this submarine that he's been talking about for years. And he eventually gets back to Washington. He arranges a meeting with Kenneth Knowles at the tracking room, Knowles was sending out information every day. It was called the DOPE, basically based on Enigma transmissions. And the captains didn't know this because this was all super top secret. Knowles would pretend that he had this amazing spy network in occupied France with the Resistance, and that there were beautiful damsels who were honey trapping SS officers and sending all this amazing information back home about UFOs. It was all complete rubbish. There wasn't one at all. But he had to disguise the origins of this amazing intelligence about where submarines were. And he goes to see Knowles, again, to meet this great man in the flesh. And he tells Knowles, yeah, I'm going to go capture submarines. So just give me the intel and I'll go do it. It'd be cool. And Knowles is absolutely horrified by this because this is a madcap scheme come up with some lunatic from Chicago who has dreams of capturing a German U-boat at sea during a fight, and the worst thing is not just that's a practical thing. Just on a higher level, Knowles is privy to information that D-Day is happening soon. The planning for D-Day is happening. They don't know what the German submarine situation is like. The Germans are rumored to have these brand new, like not next generation, but next generation submarines coming out that are going to just destroy everything that they've built so far. All their stuff was built for the older type of submarines. These new ones could go underwater for 200 miles. They could submerge silently. They were much double the speed of regular submarines. They were extremely dangerous, and they don't know where they are. And they assume that in the English Channel, Dönitz will be pulling back his remaining U-boat fleet and put them all in the channel and sink a ton of troop transports and things like that. So what this is in sort of April, May 1944. And so what Gallery's proposing threatens all of that. Because if the Germans lose a submarine, they're going to assume, unless otherwise informed, that the Enigma books, the Enigma machine, the Enigma books have fallen into American hands. And what donuts will do is obviously change all of the codes. I mean, just change everything and set the Americans and the British back to square one. And this is going to be happening right on the eve of D-Day. And Enigma is bigger than just the Navy. Remember, the Luftwaffe and the German army operate on different versions of Enigma, which means that everything is they're going to be completely blinded. The Germans will be able to transmit information about troop movements and where they're moving their panzer divisions and bombers, strike bombers, and so on, without the Allies being able to read anything. So it threatens the invasion, the successful invasion of France. So Knowles goes, yeah, don't even think about it, son. And it's not happening. But Gallery plays it very cleverly in that he promises two things. First, that if he captures this submarine, he will make sure that he brings in all the intelligence material. Gallery didn't care about the intelligence. He didn't even know what an Enigma machine was. But he promises, yeah, if there's any weird machines on board that boat, we'll bring them in, don't worry. And we'll take all of the papers and documents which are key to being able to decrypt stuff. All the papers and documents, we'll get it all, and we'll make sure that you and your friends at Naval Intelligence get it. That's my pledge to you, Commander Knowles. And the second thing is that the submarine will disappear. It has to be made to seem as if it just got sunk, got lost, something bad happened to it, and it has gone down with all hands, which means you have to make the crew disappear as well. See, because if Dönitz gets any hint, because he was paranoid about this, any hint that those Enigma books, that Enigma machine was captured, or that crew was captured who would know something about this, then he's going to change everything. So the risks are very high for this operation. So that's when, Knowles, at the same time, was also carried away by Gallery's enthusiasm. You know, Gallery is this infectious fellow, like saying, this would be so much fun. We could really just bring home the glory to the U.S. Navy, and Admiral King would love it. He appreciates this enterprising scheme. So Knowles gives him permission, and so he chooses a specific submarine for Gallery to go hunt, and it happens to be U-505, which has its own very interesting backstory, which you can get into, or you could read the book about why this particular submarine was chosen for this mission. So that's the story in a very long nutshell.
And a great story it is. A little bit about, I mean, I don't want to spoil the ending because it's such a great ending, but talk a little bit about what did happen, what information was in fact provided. And I mean, you jumped ahead on this just a little bit. What happened to U-505 and what happened to the crew?
Yeah, so Gallery goes out, he's on a mission, and he's hunting around. Knowles is providing whatever intel he can on U-505. The captain of U-505, and I go into this in the book, there are several generations of captains in the U-boat fleet. This particular fellow was had a very experienced mariner, but civil mariner before the war. He worked on passenger, but he worked off the west coast of Africa, which is where U-505 was based. So it's off the beaten track, which means it won't be missed so quickly. U-505 was regarded as the unluckiest boat in the U-boat fleet. It was a special boat, and that it had all sorts of tragedies. Its previous captain, the one that the current guy replaced, had been the only U-boat captain during the entire war who committed suicide. He just cracked, and he's again an interesting character, but he cracked and shot himself in the head during a depth charging. So it just had this terrible, and it was the most damaged boat, they tried to fix it, and it never quite worked. It was a bit of a lemon by 1944, but it's still a U-boat, and it has all the Enigma stuff on board. So the captain's a wily soul, and he knows there's a hunter-killer group looking for him because he can detect them as well. So they're playing for a month. They're playing cat and mouse. One goes left, the other goes right. One goes right, the other goes left. They're trying to find each other in the vastness of the South Atlantic, just off West Africa. And the U-boat captains, he's not stupid. He is doing things like, American doctrine said that U-boats only attack at night by this stage, but he started doing it during the day thing. So, and then it would vanish. And so whenever Gallery sent up his bombers to go on a reconnaissance mission, they didn't find anything. So it was almost as if this U-505 had escaped or just didn't really exist and Knowles had got it wrong. But Knowles had got it right. They were always within a couple of 100 miles of each other. And Gallery has a great story about it. Like, basically, they're on their last day. And his chief engineer, a man called Trissino, is saying to Gallery, if we've got 12 hours, if that, of gas in the tank. And if we don't turn back then we are going to be, we're going to run out of gas in the Atlantic, and we're going to have to be towed back to port. And that will be the end of everybody's naval career, because that is a colossal humiliation. And Gallery, just the safe thing to do would be to say, okay, well, we'll go get another sub. We'll fight a battle a different day and turn back. But there's something in his gut that just said, I know the guy's close. We just need to just eke out. Let's run on fumes if we need to. Just another day of searching. And then I think it was it. And he was also helped, and this is what Gallery is very interesting about, things like fate and coincidence and providence and so on. He was convinced that fate had kind of determined him to this and brought him to here. But really, a lot of it was luck, in that at one key moment, just as U-505, on that day, U-505 is should have gone, if he'd gone right towards the West Coast, Gallery would have missed him. But he decided to go further out to sea, which was uncharacteristic of him, and he went left. And then at 11:04 a.m., the two forces met each other. And one of I think it was Chatelain, USS Chatelain, one of the destroyers, we got a ping on the old sonar, and that was it. And then after that, the chase is on. And so that's how that all went down. As for the takeover, that's a whole section of the book. It's a lot of fun. It essentially resembles exactly what Gallery had been proposing back in Iceland, in that they would try and get a U-boat up to the surface, damage it, but stop firing when it gets to the surface. U.S. Navy, when a U-boat came to the surface, you just kept on firing at it until it sank, just so you got the kill. This way, Gallery just says, the minute it comes up, stop firing. Just fire a little bit to get the crew off. We want the crew overboard as much as we can. And then we're going to send over a couple of whale boats full of guys, like little teams of volunteers or people who had been volunteered for this, to go inside the U-boat and take it over. That's what we're going to do. So it all actually works out really well, except there was a couple of things, like it was more damage than they thought. So it was sinking into the sea. So they had to use pumps and emergency actions to get it over. It was an amazing, very dangerous thing. The Americans on board trying to right this sinking submarine could very easily have drowned. Very easily. But they managed to get a tow line on it. And so Gallery is towing this thing back to base in like some sort of triumphal Roman triumphal procession. He radios Washington, and this is on 4th of June. So, there's 2 days before D-Day. So the Navy's kind of busy with other stuff. And he says, I've captured U-505, taking it in. Where do you want me to bring her? And the Navy operators, they put it on a spy because they think it's a mistranslation or some sort of garbled transmission, because nobody's done this before. This is crazy. So they ignore it. And then he sends another message saying, I really need to bring this sucker in. Where do you want me to take it? And finally, King goes, well, wait a second. And they order him to take it to Bermuda, where there's a Marine base out in the middle of nowhere. And so they use smoke screens, and they make sure that they clear all other ships from that neighboring area, because if there's a German spy of some kind, or a German spotter plane or anything like that, if they spot a U-boat being towed, Dönitz is going to know that it's been compromised. And so the game is over. So they do all this. They bring it into Bermuda. Only one crewman was killed, one of the Germans. And it was by accident. He got shot when he was above, and he's trying to get over. But the other 49 or so, apart from the captain who had to lose a leg, and he got shrapnel. So they bring it into Bermuda, and it's put under sort of lock and key, and a bunch of very stern Marines are based around it, and it's covered up and so on. And they bring in the crew. And remember, the crew has to disappear as well. There can be no indication that anyone survived on board this boat. And so they send out some interrogators. Kenneth Knowles goes out there to sort of have a look at this amazing thing that WWII has managed to achieve. The interrogators, they go through all of the and we have the record. We actually have the interrogators' notes on each crewman. We know almost the characters of the crewmen and what they had done. And some of the notes are quite funny because the Navy would use a lot of, sometimes they use Jewish, German guys who'd come over in exile, being kicked out by the Nazis, and so would go back because they had obviously perfect German and they could talk to the crew. And a lot of the time it's quite funny. They're talking to them about, some of them were actually from Breslau or somewhere, and they had gone to the same school and things like that, but a long time before. So it's all quite cheery. And some of the Germans, they would have codes like bastard, which just meant like hardcore Nazi, not telling us anything. And then there would be like super friendly guy, that sort of thing. But some of the youngsters who was just chit-chatting about torpedoes and things like that, and basically just wanted to get out of the war. So they do all this. They give them medication, take care of them. It was the first time these guys had really seen the sun in 6 months. They're having a great time in Bermuda, lush paradise they're getting looked after by Navy doctors. They're all quite happy about it, really, because they knew the odds of surviving a U-boat sinking. Then the decision comes about what to do with them. And so they get transported to a Navy base in Virginia. And there are special orders. We can read all the POW reports from the provost marshal and so on about what to do with them, because they have to go to a POW camp. But it has to be a specific one, and they have to be completely segregated from any other German prisoners. Because if the German prisoners write home, as is their right through the League of Nations, but like the Red Cross and all this kind of stuff, then and saying, hey, guess what? I saw cousin Heinz. Wasn't he on U-505? If they'd written home to Aunt Gertrude mentioning this. So every letter had to be censored very carefully, and no letters from the U-boat crew could ever be let through. They had to be very, very careful about it. And they couldn't let the Swiss legation, which was the intermediary between the Reich government and the US government, or the, what are they called? Or the Red Cross, to let them know that they had these people. So whenever there was a Red Cross humanitarian visit of some kind to Camp Ruston in Louisiana, all of the U-boat prisoners would be taken on a 2-day camping trip to the woods 50 miles out and that thing. So they kept segregated, but they kept it secret. Dönitz never had any idea that anyone had survived. And the U-boat crew, again, their behavior in the camp is very interesting. I have a whole chapter on it, which I don't think anyone's done before. Looked like how they had their own court-martials. They had like military tribunals for people they thought were too talkative, too friendly with the Americans. There was a lot of weird Nazi behavior in certain camps. But after a while, they kind of settled down. After a while, they were even allowed out to go work in cotton fields to earn a bit of pay. They played baseball with the American Guards. They took educational classes on democracy and all this kind of, and Aristotle and Plato. You could attend a lecture on that from some professor at one of the universities. So that's how they kept it all a big secret, and it was kept a big secret until like the end of the war. And after about a year, they were demobbed and sent back to Europe, which was having a labor shortage and all that kind of thing. And some of them didn't get back for another couple of years, especially to the eastern parts of Germany. But even as early as the 1970s, Dönitz was still alive, and he was told about this sort of stuff. He's just never believed it. He didn't think it was possible. So the Germans are suffering from their own blinders. But it's such an interesting story, not just the capture, but the aftermath of the capture and how you keep these things secret. And all of the men aboard, sorry to go on a bit, but it was quite funny. After the capture, Gallery addresses the entire crew of the Guadalcanal and all the destroyers, and he gives this cod warning about, you will be hanged from the nearest yardarm and subjected to the fiercest court-martial if a word of this is breathed to anyone, not only your family and friends, but even an admiral. So it was very straight. And so they went, oh my God. And they all had to sign, sign this like fake NDA and all this kind of stuff. And they had all their souvenirs taken away from them because they didn't want to have anything identifying U-505 as a souvenir floating around in the US, just in case some local reporter picked it up and the Germans intercepted it. So, and they were all good lads. I mean, it wasn't until the early 50s that they actually came out and started talking about the capture. When Gallery goes on this big fundraising voyage, well, not voyage, but trek around the US to raise money to take care of U-505 and bring it to Chicago. So it's just quite an extraordinary story. I mean, it really is.
An amazing story it is. It's just so wonderful. It's very well researched and extremely well told, and just a lot of fun. The title again is Phantom Fleet, and I want to thank Alex Rose for a great description.
Well, thanks for having me on again, and thanks for listening to my long perorations about the story. But it's, again, when you get excited, you get excited. You just want to tell someone about it.
Clearly, it's a living memory for you.
Yeah, it was great fun going to the museum. I took my son there, and he was about, I think, 10 at the time. And we're in the archives, and in the archives they also have all the stuff that they don't put on display in the museum. And I saw him once, and he was on top of this long metal tube, and he was sort of playing on it. And I said, "Oh." And the guide or the archivist there said, "Oh yeah, that's a German torpedo," which I hope had been disarmed by. But it was there. So you see extraordinary stuff there that's not even on display, but it's well worth visiting U-5. It's an extraordinary sight to actually see a U-boat up close when you realize how big these things were, and it's magnificently preserved. So it's well worth a visit if you're in Chicago.
I told Alex off camera that literally in the late 50s, I was about 11 or 12 years old, and we were living in a distant suburb from Chicago in northern Illinois. And we had a class trip to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. And I spent the entire visit climbing all over U-505.
I think in those days it was outside, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, no, since then, because it was beginning to rust and fall to pieces and so on. So they built, I think, 20 years ago, so they built a whole wing to house it. So it's completely changed. Now it's protected and preserved. And there's a great exhibition about it.
It's a wonderful display.
Yeah, no, it's you can go inside it and take a little tour and walk around. You can actually, for the story, you can actually see where the captain, you actually know the spot where the captain committed suicide, and where so-and-so tried to throw a plug. He was trying to sink the ship at the last minute. He couldn't, and the Americans found it and plugged the hole. You can actually see the corner where he threw it, if you know the story. So it really is. It was a lot of fun to research and write.
It's a wonderful true story. Thanks again, Alex. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me on again.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.